The Boy with Golden Eyes by Marjorie Young. Chapter 1. This day, without warning, Rupert's life would change forever. For as long as he could remember, he had forever lived deep in the forest with his grandparents. This was most strange, because he had never met anyone else. His father had died before his birth, and his mother soon after. His grandparents never permitted him to leave the wood, yet always refused to speak of the world outside. Rupert was extraordinarily smart and curious. By the age of 2, he discovered his grandparents' books and soon taught himself to read. By age 5 or 6, he'd read everything in the little cottage, but then new books would appear. Rupert understood the mystery, but only in part. Every few months, his grandfather would vanish in the middle of the night, yet his grandmother would offer no explanation. He'd return within 2 weeks' time, again while Rupert slept. So the boy would awaken to find his grandfather home, bearing new books as well as food and other necessities. Thus Rupert concluded that there must be some town, or at least a village, about a week's journey away. But his grandfather would refuse to reveal where he'd gotten the supplies, or how he'd managed to transport his heavy load through the forest. The little family possessed neither horse nor cart, nor were there any roads that Rupert had ever discovered. When the boy begged for an answer to this puzzle, the cryptic reply would be, "It's not difficult if you put your mind to it." However, this told him less than nothing. Of course, having read many books, Rupert was aware that most people didn't live as he did. They dwelt in small towns, great cities, or even castles and fortresses. He knew many kingdoms existed, with different languages and customs, and how Rupert longed to experience these fascinating possibilities himself, to see the world, or at least the village he suspected was so tantalizingly close. But when he questioned his grandparents, they merely sighed and sent him off to play. Rupert did love the forest. Having no human playmates, he was friends with almost all the animals and trusted them, knowing they would never be untruthful or evasive, as he suspected his human companions often were. He had special whistles to summon his comrades, one for the wolves, another for the rabbits, and so on, though he could also communicate with the power of his unspoken thoughts. The boy somehow possessed an instinctive understanding of the woodland creatures, and was always most grateful for their company. His most beloved companion was a glorious red fox he called Kara. Fellow orphans, they shared a special communication which brought them both joy. Rupert managed to spend a portion of almost every day with her, and they were among his happiest moments. The only exception to this fellowship was the bears. Though powerful and majestic, the boy sensed they preferred their own kind, and would not welcome his instruction into their world. He had also received knowledge of the wild things that grew in the forest, having been taught to prepare healing remedies from many plants and trees. Rupert enjoyed this instruction because so often his kin were taciturn and remote. One day, a most violent storm arrived, and Rupert was ordered indoors. The tempest continued for 4 days, and the confinement was making him restless indeed. He glared resentfully at his grandfather, calmly sorting dry herbs at the small table by the fireside, his grandmother placidly kneading bread nearby. They seemed content to remain endlessly indoors. Perhaps that was because they were old, he thought, but as for Rupert, he felt imprisoned. Finally, the unprecedented rain and wind ceased, and he immediately begged permission to go out. His grandparents turned towards him in unison, sharing a quiet, unsettling stare. Finally, his grandmother spoke. "Yes, it is time. And so, fare thee well, boy." A puzzled Rupert then regarded his grandmother, who gave him a small, enigmatic smile. "Off with you then, and don't forget, keep a clear head." Rupert hesitated at their strange demeanor, and then shrugged. He turned and dashed out, thinking only that he was at last free and longing for his beloved Kara. While the storm raged, he'd envisioned her safe in a small cave she'd once shown him. He raced in that direction for almost 2 miles, blissfully inhaling the marvelous scents of the moisture-laden trees, entranced by the melody of their branches swaying in the still powerful breeze. Finally, coming to a halt, laughing with delight at his mud-splattered tunic and leggings, he called out silently to Kara. Before long, the glorious sight of his fox ring, speeding towards him, greeted his eyes, and in another instant she had leapt into his outstretched arms. It was a fine reunion, and Rupert was relieved to know his friend survived the storm without incident. She rubbed her beautiful soft face against his again and again, until he at last placed her back upon the soggy earth. He took off at a trot, knowing she would keep a pace. The boy hardly had a destination, but simply wished to exert himself after a confinement longer than he'd ever known. It was some time later that he found himself at a part of the forest normally avoided, a small clearing with one gigantic oak at its center. Surrounding it, at some distance, were 6 smaller trees. There had always been something eerie and unsettling about this place to Rupert, as all the branches of the circling trees grew away from the huge oak. But this day, what the boy saw made him stare in disbelief, for now he observed all 6 of those trees had their branches pointing towards the one towering at their center. How could this be? He wondered aloud to Kara, most bewildered. Perhaps it was the result of a storm. Yet something else was occurring, a strange sensation drawing him to that very oak like a powerful magnet pulling at the center of his being. With caution, yet tremendous curiosity, Rupert moved forward, helpless to resist. Kara moved cautiously by his side, sensing something was afoot. He circled slowly round the mighty tree, and then stared, amazed at what he beheld. The edge of a wooden box protruding from the earth. How long had it been concealed there? He could not imagine. For decades? Centuries? An irresistible power had brought him to this sight. Rupert was convinced that he was surely meant to make this discovery. Somehow, he had been born for this moment.